very excited to have him with us. He and I have been talking for a while now. He has all kinds of interesting connections with this place, surprisingly, and also has been working very hard on learning about two of our rectors who were here long ago and far away. And as you know, I think they're the Reverend Stringfellow and the Reverend Cook. So he's going to take it from here. I just want to say thank you for being here.
Testing, how's that? Okay. Now, first of all, I can't tell you how honored I am to be with you tonight to talk about these two extraordinary rectors that you had serve your Kingston Parish. I'm only going to be Paul Mitchell for you for a few minutes, and then I will portray the Reverend Frank Stringfellow. This is a costume. Okay, I was a commercial truck driver until I retired, and then I pursued my passion, which is local history. And the Stringfellow project just fell into my lap last January when my really best friend, Billy Bolt of Powhatan, who is the leading historian now because everybody else has died, he asked me, what do you know about Frank Stringfellow? Because he knew that Frank Stringfellow had been a rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, my church. I said, I don't know anything about Frank Stringfellow, but people have been asking me to write about him for our church newsletter, our Historical Society's newsletter. And I said, but nobody can tell me why I should write about it. They don't know why he's famous. What had happened is a Stringfellow descendant came by the church one day to ask me about information. Nobody could really give her any information about Reverend Stringfellow except to say when he served. And she said, well, he's quite famous. And she showed a book. And that's how people knew that he was famous. They didn't even know the title of the book. So I asked Billy Bolt, what do you know about Frank Stringfellow? And he said, what? You don't know? He said he was a famous scout and courier during the Civil War for General Jeb Stuart and for General Robert E. Lee. I was astonished by what I heard. And he was astonished that I didn't know. And he said, go home and Google him. The internet is full of information. So I ran home and I pulled him up on the internet, in Wikipedia. There's an article about him on Wikipedia. And that's just the beginning. There's so much more on the internet. But I said, this is a big story. And I'm going to research this, and I'm going to write an article about it, and get it in the Powhatan today. Now, I brought along copies of that article, and I'm going to send them around, and I encourage you to take a copy home with you. I probably don't have enough, so if you're not really interested, don't take a copy. So we start with you. Take one if you're interested and pass it along. All right. Okay, thanks. So that's an article that I spent basically 5 months of research on Frank Stringfellow, which was published in late June. And I sent copies of the article to all the churches that he was affiliated with that are still in operation, which meant a copy came here, and sent it to the schools that he was associated with, and to the Stringfellow descendants that I had become friends with during the course of those 5 months. Now, the editor of the Powhatan Today, I knew that she could not touch the article if it was a glorification of a Confederate. That's the times we're in, and I'm fine with that because we have black citizens, and we don't want them to be offended by glorifying a Confederate. We're sensitive to them. But his life was, he one of extraordinary service to the church and to people, black and white. And I put that's all in the article, and that made it publishable. Okay, now, that's all I'm going to say about that, because we want to get into his story. But I do want to give an introduction. This came from John Easton Cook's The Wearing of the Gray, and that Cook is no relation to Giles Cook. Frank Stringfellow occupied a position in many ways different from that of the regular Confederate soldiers. Often going alone on secret missions, he was entirely on his own, as there was no one near to give him orders. He depended for success on the quickness of his eye, his hand, that kind of hand, and his wits. He was silent in his movements, low-toned in his speech, moderate in his habits. Usually he knew every road and path in the country where he scouted. He slept rarely in houses, preferring the woods. He would flank enemy pickets, penetrate to their camps, learn their number and position, and was always on the lookout for stragglers from whom he could learn their plans. If he could not flank the enemy pickets, he would charge them. And if he could not glide through the lines, he would fight through. When he related his adventures, he did so with a laugh, seeing the humorous side of affairs. His life seemed chiefly attractive to him because of this side of it, and he jested about his perils with a gay spirit that was one of his greatest charms. He had escaped from deadly peril, fooled the foe, then entertained his friends around the campfire with a humorous recital of the happenings. He worked, watched, and fought, endured hardship, and risked liberty and life hourly. If he fell, it might be in the depths of some forest where his bones would molder away undiscovered. But while he was alive, he lived a full life. He loved his work and gave to the cause a piercing eye, a ready hand, and a daring soul. For his often invaluable services and his risk of life night and day, if he received nothing, he was perfectly content. He asked only the liberty to roam, to hunt the enemy after his own fashion, and to die in single combat, if he must, with the pistol. With that, Reverend Stringfellow, the audience is yours. All right. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Thank you for coming out to hear me tell the story of my life. My grandfather was a successful merchant in Fredericksburg. And when he retired from business, he bought a large farm in Culpeper County, which he named The Retreat. And it was on the Raccoon Ford on the Rapidan River, which later came to see a lot of conflict during the Civil War, that area. My father, Robert, was one of 10 children, and he inherited the farm, the retreat. So we have a lot of cousins. If you know of anybody whose name's Stringfellow or is descended from the Stringfellow, they're distant cousins. There was a man I want to mention. His name is George Campbell. He was born free, but sold into slavery by an uncle at a young age, which couldn't possibly have been legal. My father acquired ownership of George Campbell. He was 17 years older than I was. My father died when I was 2 years old. And George Campbell, up until that time, he had been farmed out. And so he received wages for his work from his employer, and my father received a portion of those wages. But when my father died, my mother needed George Campbell to run the farm, which he did. And throughout his life, never was a discouraging word said about George Campbell. He married at the age of 25 a woman named Felicia, who already had 4 children. And she ran the inside of the house. Her children were laborers on our farm. and we all worked the farm together. But often the boys, I had two older brothers, we were away at school, and then later we were away with the Civil War. When George Campbell died at 75 in 1898, there was a 2-column page article in the Culpeper Star Exponent and in the Alexandria Gazette that was titled, "Noteworthy Man Dies." The reason I bring that up is to show that there was a special relationship between the black people who lived on our farm and the Stringfellow family. We were an extended family, and that was pretty normal for most of the soldiers who owned slaves. It wasn't like the big plantations. And if you had asked me what I was fighting for, it was not about the protection or expansion of slavery. It was to defend Virginia from the Army of Northern Aggression. We perceived them as the heel of a boot that was trying to smash us. All right, so I wanted to clarify that. Now, I started out my education in the Charlottesville boarding school and finished at Episcopal High School in Alexandria. I have since learned from Paul Mitchell that the tuition there is $72,000 a year, which is insane. I don't know what's with you people. $72,000 a year. Okay. When the war broke out in 1861, I was teaching Latin. By the way, I was born in 1840. I didn't mention that. So I was 20 years old when the war broke out. I was teaching Latin and Greek at a girls' school in Nuxtemby County, Mississippi. And I rushed back by rail to enlist because we all thought that this Civil War was going to be one great big battle that the South would win and that we would be the Confederate States of America, having left the United States of America. We thought in one battle, it was going to be a short war. I didn't want to miss out. Well, I got turned down by 4 units of cavalry. I wanted to be in the cavalry. Got turned down by 4 units because they said I was too small. I was 94 pounds and a little over 5 feet tall. Okay, so I went home to the retreat and my mother helped fatten me up. I got my weight up to 110 and I said I'm going to give it one more shot to try and enlist. And I went to the Powhatan troop, which was encamped near the retreat. Well, it was in Culpeper County. But I felt like I had to have a scheme. I had to do something dramatic to prove that I was as good as they were, so that I wouldn't get turned down again. So I tied my horse up in the distant woods, and I crept into their lines, and I took one of their pickets hostage. And I had my gun on him, and I said, "You're going to call the picket to your right, and you're going to call the picket to your left to come to you. And you're going to do it real regular like, or you'll be sorry." So I hid behind a tree with my gun on him and waited. And when the 2 pickets joined him, I stepped out from behind the tree and I took all 3 of them prisoners. I took their guns and I marched them at gunpoint to their camp and to the commanding officer's tent, who was Captain John Lay. And Captain Lay said, "What's the meaning of this?" And I explained to him that I'd already been turned down by 4 units of cavalry, and I wanted to join his, and I wanted to prove to him that I was good as his men were by taking 3 of his pickets captured, prisoners. He acquiesced, he agreed, and he let me join. He did say, "What if one of my men had hollered an alarm? Would you have shot them?" And I said, "No, sir." I would have said, "Hey, can't you take a joke?" I said, "My guns weren't loaded." Now, the Powhatan troop was no ordinary troop. It had been in training for 2 years prior to the war by Colonel Philip St. George Cock of Belmead Plantation in Powhatan, who was a West Pointer class of 1835. He really took care of his men. He had a lot of money. And so these men were in beautiful uniforms that had everything they were supposed to have, and they all had good horses. Battle of First Manassas, they distinguished themselves so well that General Beauregard, who was in charge of everything up there for the Battle of Manassas, he made the Powhatan troop his personal escort. So he took it away from Colonel Koch. And Colonel Koch had been promoted to general, and then he got demoted to colonel. So he lost his Powhatan troop. He was demoted to colonel for who knows why. And on Christmas Day, 1861, at Bellamy Plantation, he put a gun to his head and ended his life. So he didn't take it well. Now, the Army was reformed in the fall of 1861, and the Powhatan troop became Company E in the 4th Regiment of the Virginia Cavalry, with Major General Jeb Stuart as its highest commander. Jeb Stuart summoned me to his tent. You can't imagine what that was like. And it was to offer me the position of being a scout and a courier, his personal scout and courier. He had about 10, so I was one of about 10 or a dozen. And of course I was honored to be asked. He explained the dangers and the perils, etc. I was just honored to be asked. I was eager to do it. I think that what caught his eye is that I was built like a racehorse jockey, being so small, and that I could really ride fast and well. So this is a quotation I'm going to read from Confederate Scout. I was only a private soldier for a great part of the war, and but a boy. It could not be expected that I should have done very much or known very much. What I have to communicate is almost entirely from memory. My efforts to keep a diary failed because it was often lost to the enemy. That I shall speak often of myself is because much of my experience was acquired when I was alone with God. I shall speak of things as I saw them. I was what is called in military language a scout in the Army of Northern Virginia. I began by running the gauntlet at Manassas and passed our pickets before I attempted the enemy's. Then I ventured out of our lines little by little until I was home in the Northern Army. General Jeb Stuart ordered me to report on detail for special duty as a scout, but also as John Mosby, who later became a partisan. My business was to get information, but my taste and tempting opportunities often led me to assume the character of a partisan. I often indulged in capturing picket posts, engaging in raiding parties on wagon trains, in delaying the march on an advancing column, or in seeking to surprise lightly guarded generals at headquarters, where they felt secure from attack. Now, when I would go out on a scouting assignment, I had to pierce picket lines of the opposing force. And my technique, my favorite technique, was to just advance at night on my horse until I was aware that there was a presence in front of me. And then if the picket would say, "Halt, who goes there?" my answer was, "Halt, who goes there? Form ranks of 4! Draw sabers! Prepare to charge! Charge!" And I would race at him, firing with both guns. Well, he fled. He fled. And once I got well into the woods, I made a right turn or left turn, and now I was behind lines. And that was my technique for getting behind enemy lines. Now, one time, I went out on a scouting assignment, and I was coming back to my own lines. I was at the very same point where the rebel pickets had been, and a man shouted, "Halt, who goes there?" And I answered, "Stringfellow of the 4th. Well, the next thing I know, I had 3 barrels pointed to my chest by Union soldiers. They had overrun our pickets while I was out on scouting duty. I had 3 rifle barrels pointed at my chest. And I said, "Well, boys, you sure got me this time." out my sidearms, I had two, and I handed them to the man in the middle. He handed off his rifle to the man next to him and took my firearms out of my hands. When he did so, I pulled my Derringer out from my belt, shot him in the chest, pulled back my handguns and shot the other two men, and then I got the hell out of there. One time, I had been scouting all night long, and I found a deep thicket in a remote place. And I thought, well, I'll sleep here during the day, and when night falls, I'll return to my scouting duties. Well, while I was sleeping during the day, suddenly the blanket was pulled away from me, and there were 3 Union soldiers there saying, something like, "We got you now, Red." Well, I pulled the blanket back over me, and I said, "Oh, leave me alone, fellas. I'm tired. I've got to get some sleep." Well, they thought that was hilarious, that I assumed that the 3 men who had awakened me were my colleagues. They thought that was hilarious. Well, while I had the blanket over me, I found my pistol and had it in my hand. When they yanked the blanket away from me a second time, I shot them and got the hell out of there. Now, my children, by the way, my children and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren called me, they didn't call me Papa or Granddad or anything like that. They always called me Scout. And it's because that's what I wanted to be called, Scout. So my little grandchildren would say, "Scout, did you kill many Yankees during the war?" And my answer was always, "I hope not." And I meant that sincerely. So when I shot him, man, I didn't know if I'd actually killed him, because I wasn't there to see what happened. And I hope that I didn't kill as many as I shot, that's for sure. Now, a few more of my adventures before I get to the last big one. One time near Bull Mountain Run in Fauquier County, I was resting in the home of friends I knew called the Stingers. And it was night, and suddenly we heard galloping horses coming, down the road towards our house. And I looked out, and they were federal cavalry. And they came to our front door and our back door simultaneously. So I said, I have to hide. And their servant girl named Martha suggested that I hide in a garret, which was like a little attic. So I climbed the stairs with her, and I got to the garret, and I said, "It's empty. There's no place for me to hide." And she said, "Lay on top of the board that goes across the rafters," which I did, but I knew that I could still be seen. So I drew my pistols, and I waited, prepared to shoot my way out of capture or die trying. Well, within minutes, Martha Stinger was coming back up those same steps again, this time leading a federal cavalryman who wanted to inspect the garret. Well, she stood directly underneath the board that I was laying on, holding her candle. By doing that, the shadow of the board hid me. I was in the shadow of the board. And the federal officer looking around didn't see me lying there. Well, I knew what she had done. It wasn't by chance. She hid me. And she saved my life. And I said to myself, I owe her a debt which I will repay. And I'll get back to that later on in this story. But it was a remarkable thing. Another time, I captured a federal officer who was well out of his lines, which was odd, all by himself. I took him prisoner and I escorted him to the southern picket line. But I searched him before I released him as a POW. And I found an invitation to a dance in the Mozart Hall of the Brady Station, where the Union Cavalry was camped at that time. An invitation to a dance, and it was addressed to Sally Marston, whom I knew. And I asked him what was the meaning of this invitation. He wouldn't tell me. So after I released him, I went to Sally Marston's home. And I said, I captured this union officer. He had this invitation. Were you planning to go to this dance? And she said, oh no. She said, I had gone to seek his help in finding out what had happened to my brother who was a POW somewhere. And I said, oh, I see. Well, would you mind if I went in your place? And she said, no. So I got her and her mother to dress me in her ball gown, adding padding where needed, and a bonnet. And her father drove me in a buggy to the dance. Well, he drove me in a buggy to the picket lines, and then I took it from there with my invitation that the soldiers allowed me to pass. And the father walked on back to the house. Now, so I'm chatting up the federal officers at the dance, dressed as a woman. Remember how small I was. So I could pass for a woman. Well, this was going along great until some woman there recognized me and told her escort that that's not a woman, that's Frank Stringfellow. So this officer asked me to step outside, and he confronted me with the accusation that his lady friend had made. And I said, sir, if you will just turn around for 1 minute, when you turn back around, I will reveal to you whether I'm a man or a woman. Well, he thought this sounded pretty good. So he turned around. When he turned back around, in the meantime, I lifted my gown, and I was wearing my pants with those leggings rolled up. And I had my derringer in my belt. So when he turned around, I pressed my derringer into his midsection. And I said, sir, you are now my prisoner, and you are going to escort me out of here. Yes. So we went to my buggy, and he escorted me, and then the Yankee pickets were, they let us pass. It's an officer and his date. Sure, let him go. Well, we got to the southern picket lines, and I turned him over as a POW, and then I returned the buggy and the gown. End of that story. One more before I get to the big story. Do you remember I said that there would be conflict at the retreat? So there was a skirmish, a serious skirmish, which left 1,000 ball holes in that house. And the house had been shelled 5 times by cannonball. My mother was outside doing chores, and she caught a piece of shrapnel in her ankle. The Union soldiers took her to another house to recuperate, or to mend. And she was in the upstairs bedroom of this house, which was the local headquarters of the Union Army. Well, our friend George Campbell got word to me that my mother had been wounded, but that she was all right. She was on the mend and where she was. He did not want me to worry. Well, I went to Jeff Stewart and I said, I told him what the situation was. I said, I want to go visit my mother. Now keep in mind, she's in the 2nd floor of a house that is occupied by the Union Cavalry. It's their headquarters. And I'm telling Jeff Stewart, I want to go visit my mother. He said, I can't possibly allow you to do that. It's a death sentence. But I'll tell you what, I want you to go to that area and find out everything you can about the Union forces in that area. Which was his way of saying, if you think you can visit her, do it. But I'm not going to order you or give you permission to do it. You're going to have to do that on your own. Well, I snuck up to the house, and sure enough, either George or Lucretia came outside at night, maybe to dump urine. Who knows? But I was there, and I whispered to them, it's Frank Stringfellow. I'm here to see Mom. I said, bring me out a dress, a work dress, and a long-eared bonnet, which they did, and I was able to accompany them back inside the house. I stayed with my mother for 3 days. And whenever a federal officer, a federal soldier came into the room, I hid in the closet. But after 3 days, I felt certain she was mending well, and she was okay. So I returned to General Stewart's headquarters, and he was thrilled to see me because he was so worried about me. But I had so much information to give him from overhearing the conversations that took place on the floor below me. Now, here's the last story about Civil War exploits. I left the office of President Jefferson Davis and Judah Benjamin on March 5th, 1865. There's only a little more than a month left in the war, but we didn't know that. But it was grim. And I was being sent on the most important, dangerous assignment ever. I feel like I'm missing a word in there. Now, I've taken oaths of secrecy, and I've honored those oaths. Paul Mitchell has done a lot of research, and he has a theory about what my assignment was. I was to go to Washington as a spy, again. I can neither deny nor, I can neither claim that this is true or not true. It's Paul Mitchell's theory, but I'll share it with you. Other historians have agreed with him and have written books about the same thing. If you were like me when you were in high school, well, that's Paul Mitchell speaking, excuse me. John Wilkes Booth was not a lone wolf, as was often taught in schools. He was part of a Washington spy ring of Southern sympathizers, and he was a leader, maybe not the ultimate leader, but a leader of the Washington spy ring. He had a plan to take Abraham Lincoln hostage and get Abraham Lincoln back to Richmond. As foolhardy as that sounds on the surface, it was actually very sound. And the reason is, Abraham Lincoln was in the habit of leaving Washington on a Friday evening to escape his generals, the war, the legislators, the press, the citizens, and most of all, his wife. And he would go by carriage to the soldiers' home, which was 5 miles outside of Washington. And he rode in an enclosed carriage so that people wouldn't go, oh, there goes President Lincoln. And he had a small security detail so that people wouldn't go, oh, that must be President Lincoln. But John Wilkes Booth's plan was, we wait until the carriage comes to a rather remote location along the, in between the White House and the soldiers' home. We jump, kill the guards, the security detail. We don their uniforms. We turn the carriage towards southern Maryland, where we will be able to cross the Potomac with our contacts and get him to Richmond by way of what we would call 301, that route. So it was actually a good plan. My mission as a spy, according to Paul Mitchell, was to expedite the plan. And for that, we needed basically to bribe an official close to President Lincoln who could tell us what day he was leaving, what time he was leaving, how many would be in his security detail, and what route they would take. That's what we needed in order for this plan to work. So I had money to bribe an official, and I arrived in D.C. the day after the inauguration. I walked up the Capitol steps, the White House steps, and I spit on the building to show my contempt for President Lincoln, feelings that changed later in life. And then I lived in hotels and boarding houses, always trying to find the perfect man that I could proposition. And I finally found a guy that I thought was the right guy. And I made the proposition to him, and he sounded like he was going to accept the money I offered and give me the information I wanted. So I went by his office a day or two later, and I found him huddled with high-ranking military men. And I knew at once, in an instant, that he had given me up, and they were planning on what to do about me. So I now knew that I had to get out of Washington, that my ship was sunk. By the way, my cover during that time was to study for and pass an exam in dentistry. I had 4 weeks to do it, and I did it. When I left, I had papers certifying that I was a dentist and I could practice dentistry in Maryland. John Wilkes Booth used his carriage to take me 12 miles outside of Washington in the direction of southern Maryland. From there, I got a carriage of my own to take me further. Well, we were halted by, I guess you'd call it a security, at a security checkpoint. They took charge of my carriage. They asked me, for my papers, and when they saw that I was a dentist, they smiled at one another, which told me, aha, they're looking for a dentist. I'm the man they're looking for. This is bad. Well, they sent me on to Lieutenant Mathews, who was in charge of the federal forces in that area. Now, I've got 4 men on horseback riding or surrounding the carriage. One in front, one behind, and one on each side. I had papers on me that they could not see, or my ship was sunk. So I ate the papers en route, using every bit of saliva I had. But there was one I forgot, and it was addressed to a Confederate officer. It was in another pocket. So when I got to see Lieutenant Lafferty, he had me searched. They found that letter to a Confederate officer, and he sent me to a southern jail for the night, and with a guard named Green. So on the way, now I knew that I had to escape, or I was dead. They execute spies. So I suggested we stop at an ordinary for dinner, and I would pick up the tab. And while we were having, he sat with his back to the fireplace, and there was an axe beside the fireplace. And I kept stoking the fire, getting up to stoke the fire, but really what I was doing was tempted to bury the axe in his head and flee on foot. And I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I just couldn't bring myself to bury that axe in his head, even though it meant my life if I didn't escape. Because he didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve it. Well, when we got to the southern jail, I asked if I could speak with him discreetly. So we walked away from everybody else. And I told him that I had an opportunity to kill him at the ordinary, but I hadn't because it wasn't right. And he thanked me for not killing him. And I said, if you will just turn your head and give me about time to run about 10 paces, I will give you $500. He said, do you have it on you? I said, no, but I'll get it to you. He said, I can't do that. He said, are you a Mason? I said, no, I'm not. He said, that's too bad, because if you were, I could do that for you, because the Masons have a bond which exceeds all other bonds. I said, I'm not a Mason, but I'm a Christian. Can I appeal to you as another Christian to allow me to escape? He said, no, I can't do that. So as we're walking back to the jail, he said, if you want to live, you have to escape tonight, because in the morning you're going to be carried to Washington, where you will be executed. Okay. Now, I was not able to escape that night, but they delayed transportation for another day. I was in a jail with blockade runners and with deserters. And if any of them had seen me making any sort of preparations for an escape attempt, they would have turned me in to try and, score points with the guards. So I had to hide everything I was doing from my fellow inmates as well as the jailers. Now, the building we were in, the door was unlocked, but the guards were positioned on benches in a V shape. If this is the door, they were on benches like this, and in order to get to the door, you would have to jump over them. were on their benches, which is what I did in my bare feet once I heard them both snoring. So I wasn't in bare feet, I was in stocking feet, because I was trying to be as quiet as I possibly could. And I jumped over them, they were sleeping, and I opened the door and I flung myself out and I ran like mad. Well, I was in bare feet, so the footprints I was leaving were that of a barefoot person, which would make me easy to follow. When I got to a brook, I raced along the brook. Again, that was hiding my footprints, but I had to get out of the brook without leaving footprints. And finally, I found an overhanging limb, and I climbed up the limb, and then once I got into the interior of the tree, I crossed that limb and got to another limb going onto the high side of the bank, and I jumped off. Now I wasn't in mud anymore, so I wasn't leaving footprints, and there was a fallen tree there, a big fat fallen tree that had accumulated a lot of leaves. So I laid down on the upside of that fallen tree, and I covered myself with leaves, and I stayed there all day without moving a muscle, because I was afraid if I moved even the slightest bit, the leaves would shimmy down and expose me. And then I heard the men walking by, riding by all day long looking for me. When night fell, I took off. And it took me 21 days to cross the Potomac River. When I got to the other side, when I got to Virginia, I learned that Lee had surrendered, Lincoln had been assassinated. The newspapers were reporting that I was the most dangerous man in the Confederacy because they thought that somehow I was associated with Lincoln's assassination. And there was a $10,000 bounty on my head. I had no country to live for at that point. And I went to Canada. And I stayed in Canada for a year and a half and worked as a farm laborer. And I had an epiphany while I was in Canada. And I think it was in part because I was away from Southern influences. And I began to feel like that a lot of what I had done during the Civil War was wrong. For instance, I was killing men who were trying to keep the United States of America together. And I was killing men who were trying to abolish slavery, whereas the Confederate States of America was trying to divide the nation and to protect and expand slavery. So I had this epiphany, and I wrote my fiancée, who's Emma Smith. Her picture's on the piano, I think. And I told her I was coming back to Virginia, and that I was coming with a contrite heart. And for those of you who might read that article later on, you'll see that the editor gave that as a headline to my article, A Contrite Heart. So we married in early 1867, and I began farming in Halifax County on a place called Wakefield. But I felt like my life had been spared by God for a reason. In all those battles, gunfights, near captures, escapes, I hadn't died. I should have died. I mean, there were bullet holes in my uniform. And I said, well, God must want me to serve him, and so I will serve him. So while I was farming, I prepared for the Episcopal Seminary of Virginia, which is now called the Virginia Theological Seminary. And I graduated in 1876 and ordained as a deacon. And I immediately got a job at St. Luke's Episcopal Church. That was my church in Powhatan County. The treasurer of that church and on the vestry was John Lay, the man who had been captain of the Powhatan troop. He had been a judge before the war. He was a practicing attorney for Life of Virginia after the war, and he hired me to be the rector of that church. Now, in addition to that church, I also served concurrently 4 other Episcopal churches in Powhatan. Mannequin, Grace Church, Emmanuel, and St. James. And I didn't stop there. There were 4 churches in adjacent Cumberland County without a rector. And I held services there at those 4 churches and kept their doors open. And then lastly, I preached regularly at a small black church called St. James Baptist Church, which did not have their own rector. So that was 10 churches I was taking care of. St. James Baptist Church is also where I started the Martha Stinger School for Colored Girls. Do you remember? She saved his life, Martha Stinger, and he said, I have a debt to repay. And his repayment was to start that school. Now, President Jefferson Davis wrote him a letter in about, say, 1882, in which he asked for Stringfellow to write stuff that he could put in his memoirs. Well, what Frank Stringfellow, he wrote an article, he didn't write a letter to Jefferson Davis. He wrote his mission report. You remember? He was sent on a mission on March 5th, but he never saw President Jefferson Davis again after that. So this was it was a 16-page mission report. And I shared it with people before I mailed it. And people were like, wow, this is incredible. This is incredible. The stories that you just heard tonight were just a small sampling of what was in. They said, you need to publish your memoirs. And I said, okay. So I did, and it was called Scout Life. And it was probably about 60 pages long. It was wildly popular. It sold for 50 cents a copy, and it was just selling out. Everybody loved Scout Life. Well, that led to a lecturing career where I would, go into a big hall like Mozart Hall at a monumental church in Richmond, and people would pay 50 cents a head to hear me tell my stories, which were given in, I would say, the manner of maybe Garrison Keillor. It made people just laugh and laugh and laugh. Somebody, when you heard me talk about him going to the dance dressed in a woman's gown, you were laughing, and that's the way people laugh when he gave his lectures. And they're very popular, but he did a little bit of preaching, just a little bit, soft cell preaching. He said that it was about forgiveness. He said to seek forgiveness, not about forgiving, but about seeking forgiveness. You start with a contrite heart, and then you pray to God for forgiveness. Claim forgiveness by faith, and then prove yourself anew in Christ by your righteous living and your godly deeds. So that's a soft cell message, but it was always in his lectures. And the newspapers covered his lectures. He was as popular, I would say, as Garrison Keillor would if Garrison Keillor was walking around giving these talks, or Jerry Clowers, if you know who Jerry Clowers was. Now, as a minister, I think he was just like Billy Graham. He was kind of like fire and fury as a minister. Now, in 1882, he left Powhatan and came up here he came to Middlesex Parish and Mathews Parish concurrently to serve. And also in 1882, when he left Powhatan, Bishop Whittle made him an evangelist at large and paid him $1,000 a year for that, which meant he could really go to any church he wanted to because his income was coming from the Diocese of Virginia. And so I think he was attracted to challenges throughout his career. The churches that really needed him and the churches where he could have the biggest impact in, but also churches that would allow him to go on speaking tours without a problem with the vestries. Because he gave his lectures in every city and town in Virginia over a period of more than 20 years, and in places like Baltimore, Lexington, Louisville, and Atlanta. Tremendously popular as a speaker. Now, he came here, and I don't know much about his time here, but he he left in 1888 to go to Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, from there to Martinsville, then to Nelson County, where he served 10 churches concurrently. There's just one more thing I really want to mention about him before I start talking about Reverend Major Giles Cook. And that is that in 1898, his oldest son, Martin, said he wanted to join the army to fight in the Spanish-American War. Well, Frank Stringfellow knew what war was about. War is hell. And so he wanted to go with his son as a chaplain to serve in this war. And he was turned down because he was 57 years old. Well, he wrote a letter to President McKinley in which he described that during the Civil War, as a spy in Washington, he was trying to overhear what General Grant was saying to the person he was standing next to. And he found himself directly behind General Grant. And he could have shot General Grant in the back, which would have pleased a lot of Confederates if he had done that. But he didn't, because he said, I don't shoot men in the back. And I think that was his way of letting President Grant know, because he had written President Grant and told him this, that he had nothing to do with Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln was shot in the back of the head. And federal authorities may have still believed that Frank may have had something to do with that. So I think that was his way of letting President Grant know, I had nothing to do with Lincoln's assassination. Now, President Grant responded, thank you very much for not shooting me in the back. I owe you a debt. If you ever need a favor, just ask. Well, he never asked. What he did was ask President McKinley to honor Grant's offer, which President McKinley did. So he was allowed to become a chaplain and a captain in the United States Army, the army he fought against for 4 years, and joined his son in the Virginia Infantry Volunteers. Frank was a chaplain of the 4th Regiment. His son was in the 2nd Regiment. Now, they trained in Richmond, and then they trained in Jacksonville, Florida, but during the course of the war, which started in 1898 and ended in 1898, they never went to Cuba. Those were regular forces fighting. They were held in reserve, and then after the war ended, the regular troops went to the Philippines, and the Virginia Volunteers, along with other such units from around the country, went to Cuba as an occupying force. But Frank, seeing there was no war, he resigned his commission, which officers are allowed to do. And he ended up serving many churches, more. He did serve as chaplain of the Woodbury Forest School, and their tuition is $64,000 a year. Now that's all I'm going to talk about. I have one closing statement I want to read. Yes. So now this is Paul Mitchell reading this came from the Confederate Scout book. None was braver or more intelligent. Innumerable were his adventures, almost incredible his hairbreadth escapes and his reckless daredevil exploits. The annals of fiction contain nothing more moving or curious than some of his experiences. He was a ranger born, passionately devoted to his dangerous calling. He followed it not from hope of reward or because of ambition for discretion or distinction. He was never so happy as when beating up the quarters of the enemy or throwing them into confusion by some sudden attack. In person, he was suited to his calling, a good hand with pistol and saber, quick of eye, and with nerves no peril could shake. He usually preferred to go on his secret missions alone, depending on his own quick eye, strong arm, and trusted weapons. We're done with Reverend Stringfellow. All right, now, let's talk about Reverend Giles, Reverend Major Giles Faulkner Cook. He was born 2 years before Frank, in 1838, in Portsmouth. And his education started at Norfolk Military Academy, and and one of his best friends there was William Taylor, who they would go to VMI together later. Now, Mr. Cook got thrown out. He got expelled from Norfolk Military Academy. So he finished up his pre-college studies at Fleetwood Academy in King and Queen County, and he entered the VMI class of 1859, as did his friend Walter Taylor. If I said William Taylor, I meant Walter Taylor. He got expelled from VMI once, got reinstated, got expelled again, got reinstated. So he was a bad boy. I mean, he's just a bad boy. Now, after his diploma was already signed, so let's say he's a day away from graduating, he has an argument with one of his professors about the grade he had received. An argument that was apparently so noteworthy that, I'm talking about it now. The professor was Thomas Jackson, who later became Stonewall Jackson. That's who he's arguing with about his grade, but his diploma is already a real thing. Okay, now, he started practicing law in Petersburg, and then when the war came out, the first thing he did as a rebel, as a private, was to attack Fort Norfolk, or Norfolk Fort, and steal, that's probably not the right word, but confiscate 8,600 pounds of gunpowder, which he sent up to Richmond by way of steamboat. And I got a feeling he was on that steamboat, because he next pops up visiting Bellmead Plantation in Powhatan to see Colonel Philip St. George Cocke, who was a kinsman. And Colonel Cocke made him a lieutenant in his staff. Well, when Beauregard took over, he took Cocke and made him one of his staff officers. All right? And altogether, he was never, throughout the Civil War, he was not a staff officer for a general. He started out with Beauregard, he served General Sam Jones, he served Braxton Bragg. He saw all kinds of stuff. He was there at the Siege of Charleston, he was there at the Battle of Chattanooga, he was there at Shiloh. And towards the end of the war, he was, this is like the fall of 1864, he was in Petersburg, serving again on the staff of General Beauregard again. Now, he kept a very, very precise diary throughout the Civil War. And I was able to read excerpts from the fall of 1864 and from the last few days of the war itself. And I was amazed really by what he read, because he was an assistant adjutant general and an inspector general. And what I thought was his duties were very much like a courier and a scout, except that he was within his own lines, unlike Stringfellow, who was always outside, But he inspected our fortifications. When I mean southern fortifications. He just inspected everything. Wanted to see how good everything was, and he was paying attention to what the enemy was doing, and he was talking to commanders and getting their verbal reports, and then he would go to his own General Beauregard and to General Lee, who was 17 miles north of Richmond, and give these verbal reports on all this information that he had acquired. And in his diary, he just mentions that I gave a briefing to General Lee. He didn't go into detail, but he was incredibly active. And it seemed to me most of it was all verbal, not written. And maybe it's because it was coming too fast. When they fled Petersburg, in, I guess, early April, he was wounded at the Battle of Sailor's Creek. He took, I think, a shrapnel to the ankle, and he lost his horse and his equipment. When Lee departed come out to return to Richmond, he took a route that took him through Cumberland and Powhatan because he wanted to, his last camp, he wanted to take place at the home of his older brother, Charles Carter Lee, at Windsor Farm on Fine Creek, which is just a couple of miles from where I grew up. Giles Cook was in an ambulance, which really meant a wagon, with that party. But when they got to Belmead, that's when Cook went on to be fully healed at Belmead, which were kinsmen to him. And this is from his diary. It's the last entry in his diary. Written Tuesday. It cannot have been written on Tuesday, April 11th. That's a typo. All right, broke up our camp and left for Belmead and Richmond about 6 a.m. I reached Belmead on Thursday morning, April 13th, and the general and the rest of the staff kept on to Richmond. Actually, they went to Windsor Farm, the home of Charles Carter Lee. Farewell, war. Farewell, general. Farewell, brother staff officers and companions in arms. I am now a citizen slave, and what will become of me and the people of our Southland, God only knows. Thus ends the diary that I have kept since the commencement of the war. Now, he started immediately teaching school in Petersburg. And they founded, he and a man named Thomas Hume founded a school called Big Oak. Now, the federal government required Virginia to rewrite its constitution to allow freedmen all equal opportunities that the white men enjoyed. And that involved the educational system. So the very first public high school in Virginia was in Petersburg, and well, he wasn't a reverend yet. Giles Cook was its first principal. 2 years later, it became a high school. He continued to be its principal. He started teaching Sunday school classes for blacks at 2 churches in Petersburg while he was studying for the ministry. He did not have to go to a seminary. I don't know how he was able to pull that off. I guess it's the bishop needed him and wanted him to do this. I think the Episcopal Church was very, very interested in these unchurched, uneducated black citizens and wanted to incorporate them into the Episcopal Church, and was willing to raise money to provide educational opportunities. I think the Episcopal Church was very, very hot on that concept and didn't give up on it until the Depression era. There aren't very many Episcopal black churches that I'm aware of. Blacks seem to prefer Baptist churches, from what I've seen. And having gone to Baptist and Episcopal, I understand. All right, now, Baptists just to have fun. All right, so he started this school, and he became a minister. I mean, first of all, he became a deacon. I'm thinking about, gosh, I got it here. He became a deacon in 1871. He became a rector in 1873. And he was a rector of both a white church and a black church in Petersburg. The black church was St. Paul's. And they founded a black private school, Episcopal-based school, and they created a divinity school for blacks after Bishop Payne. And that divinity school later got associated with the Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. After 20 years of pretty much committing his life to the education of blacks, as a minister, he left that to younger, abler hands, and he became the rector of 3 churches in Maryland, Perryville, Northeast, and St. Mary Ann's. And his wife died and he remarried his organist. And then the next church he took was in Kentucky, but his wife was not happy in Kentucky. So they moved back, and when they did, they came here in 1904. And he was the rector here until 1915. Then he went to Portsmouth, which was the city of his birth, and served for 2 years. But they came back here because they loved Mathews so much, and they bought Palace Green. Now, this man lived to be 98 years old. So after he retired, he lived another 20 years, from 1917 to 1937. And those were, in my opinion, those were his glory years, because he was the oldest living staff member for General Lee. I don't know if I made that clear, but when Beauregard was sent south in the fall of 1864, Lee took on Giles on his staff. Okay, so he was the oldest living member of Lee's staff, which was, that was noteworthy. So when he lived here, he had historians and authors come to visit him and interview him, including Dr. Douglas Southall Freeman, the Pulitzer Prize winner, who wrote a 3-volume set on Robert E. Lee, wrote Lee's lieutenants, wrote a 3-volume set on General Washington. So Dr. Douglas Southall Freeman referred to Reverend Major Giles Cook as the grand old man. And he was also the oldest living VMI alumnus for the longest time. So VMI was constantly honoring him at their functions. And he was a lifetime appointed chaplain general of the United Confederate Veterans. So anytime they had a gathering, such as for a reunion, he was always there to give the benediction. So his life was full of, he was a VIP. He was just a very important person. And the newspapers kept talking about it. Now you have a plaque somewhere in this church dedicated to him. I'm going to read the wording on that plaque. In gratitude to God for the faith and for the life of Giles Buckner Cook, soldier of the cross, 1838-1937, Major and Assistant Adjutant and Inspector General, Confederate States Army. He gave his youth to the defense of his country, served as aide to General P.G.T. Beauregard, and was the last survivor of the personal staff of General Robert E. Lee. He gave the rest of his life to the cause of Christ in the ministry of the Episcopal Church, a pioneer in the education of the Negro, rector of Kingston Parish, 1904-1915, ever the champion of right in the spirit of Christ, fight the good fight of faith. That concludes my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found things of interest there. Reverend Barker, what do you want me to do now? Be here. Oh, listen, I gotta mention one more thing about why this is such a great honor. I was a page in the House of Delegates in 1970. Our speaker was John Warren Cook, and we pages admired and revered John Warren Cook. All of them would agree with me when I say that. And I chose to go to VMI because John Warren Cook was a VMI alumnus. I wanted to be like him.